to those people. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Lardner from the Marxist Education Project. I'm really happy that Andy agreed to talk about Henri Lefebvre, Louis Althusser, humanism, anti-humanism in the Marxist tradition, what this means for us today, almost a quarter of the way through the 21st century. I need to get back to my mechanical things of letting others into this talk, but I do want to let everyone know that Andy has been, this is his third or fourth trip to the MEP already, along with other trips he made to the Brecht Forum in the past. Last year we hosted Andy for his book that is still available for monthly review, Marx, Dead and Alive. We have copies if you still want them. I have, our bookstore will be updated later this week. But right at this moment, I'm turning the floor over to you, Andy, to begin your presentation because I'm still, sure. I didn't realize there would be this much of a demand for a talk on Lefebvre and Althusser, but it's incredibly it's being well subscribed, to say the least. Andy, the Zoom floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Michael, and always a great pleasure to be at MEP. So I'm very grateful that you invited me here. I feel it's a little bit intimidating talking about humanism and anti-humanism because it is a contentious theme that is likely to split people. But I returned to it this last few years, thinking about it, particularly in the context of what's been going on in the pandemic. And I got to Henri Lefebvre. I mean, I've never left either person, and I'm a slight oddball in the Marxist tradition because I love both of them, and you're not meant to really love both of them, but I kind of do love both of them. I've obviously written a lot more about Henri Lefebvre than I have Althusser, but Althusser has always been a little bit of a sort of hero for me in many ways. And it's nice to be able to talk about Althusser in relation to Henri Lefebvre and to think about how the two people related to one another in their time, but also to think about how we may be able to relate to each one in our time. And a lot of this was kickstarted by some anniversaries, really. The anniversary of the Paris Commune was one big one last year, 150th anniversary. And a quieter one was the 50th anniversary of Henri Lefebvre's Urban Revolution. And I suppose I started to think about this in the context, an urban revolution, the kind of ideas that Henri Lefebvre's humanist Marxism was espousing. That book was very much in praise of cities, in praise of what cities can bring in terms of encounters, in terms of assembly, in terms of the politics of the city. And this was done at a time when, when cities were de-encountering, people were leaving, that cities were seen as part of the problem in terms of the pandemic. And so cities were besieged really at a time when the 50th anniversary of the urban revolution was taking place. Similarly, with the Paris Commune, I mean, the Paris Commune was very interesting because in 1871, for those 73 days of the Commune, Paris was besieged by Prussians. It was at war, so it was bombarded in a sense by Prussian forces. And I was sort of thinking, well, actually, the kind of conditions that were going on there aren't dissimilar to the sort of conditions that were going on in cities. Cities were besieged, not by war, but a kind of war with a virus. And what was fascinating was looking at some of the things that were happening in the Commune again, but always thinking about it in the sense of what does it mean for organizing neighborhoods? What does it mean for making cities more democratic? What does it mean with thinkings of questions of equity in the city? What does it mean about the public realm? Because the public realm, one of the things the pandemic showed was the public realm has been kind of really, really hammered hitherto since the 70s that the neoliberal paradigm has actually undermined anybody's collective capacity to deal, whether it be public health, whether it be urban infrastructure, whether it be healthcare, etc., etc. We've seen how the public realm has been under fire. So I was interested in just thinking about how one could conceptualize the urban revolution now, how one could put that alongside the Paris Commune now, and think about it in terms of some of the political possibilities or some of the political impossibilities. And Henri Lefebvre himself, who's always a very playful Marxist, always says that there's always possibility, even with impossibility. So the essays were provoked by what was going on now, and perhaps how we could situate both book and event in a world of COVID. And so related to that was the notion that what we've also been seeing with the pandemic is a particular reconfiguration of the way in which the individual relates to society as well. And we can see, all those debates about freedom and necessity, agency, structure, questions of the individual vis-a-vis society seem to be debates that got played out in the battle between humanism and anti-humanism in the 1960s and in the 1970s. And thinking about how those old debates resonated a little bit with questions of freedom. People are talking about individual liberty, the right not to wear a mask, putting a mask on to protect the public, to protect other people in a social context was seen as taking away individual liberty from certain people. So it was also clear that actually certain liberties had to be taken away when one had to think about the problems of dealing with a virus on a global population level. So I was also struck by maybe it's time to look at some of those debates about humanism and anti-humanism, about what is Marxism about? Is it about individual liberty? Is it about freedom of subjectivity that Hegel said and Henri Lefebvre was always very much into? Or is it something maybe a little bit more that isn't about thinking about individual liberty, but it's more about what Althusser always said, that it's not about discovering human essences or affirming liberty. It's about the struggle for democracy for the working classes. So there's something particular about addressing class exploitation and seeing about class struggle and seeing how actually Marxism was much more about the collective and finding some resolution for working class exploitation and working class democracy. So these kinds of issues were in some ways provoking me and prompting me to really recontextualize some of the old debates that seem not that old, really. And could we put new glosses on them and could we reconsider them again? And so that was the idea behind some of the essays I'd been doing last year. And it's something which is fascinating as a piece of intellectual and political history. It's also fascinating for a piece of history in terms of the Marxist left and what might be considered as left of it, and whether these debates, these philosophical debates, actually do they matter anymore? Do they still matter? Aren't there more similarities between humanists and anti-humanists than there are? There are more similarities and differences when we contextualize it in the current world, where I think people on the left need to know who their friends are. And one of the other things that struck me, and I don't know whether anybody out there has ever read Nikolai Gogol's short story called The Quarrel Between the Two Ivans. Now, I don't know whether that is familiar to anybody, but this was a short story that Gogol, the Russian-Ukrainian writer, wrote in 1835, and it's a lovely short story of about 30 pages long. When he talks about these two guys, the two Ivans, they were close friends. They lived in in a Ukrainian provincial village. They had so much in common, and yet they fell out and became mortal enemies. And they fell out when you read the story because one of them wanted to borrow one of the Ivan's gun, and he didn't want to lend him the gun because it was a family heirloom. And he said, you're a goose for asking me for this gun. And the fact that he called him a goose was enough to just disrupt and completely disintegrate this hitherto friendship that these two Ivans had. And afterwards, it just escalated into this, this mutually assured destruction between the two of them. The two friends, they built a big fence between their properties. They accused each other of trespassing. They started to take lawsuits against each one of them. And the whole thing just escalated into almost a fully blown war between the two friends over a few name calls, and calling one a goose, which maybe could be calling one a Stalinist. It could be one, or the other one might be calling the other one an idealist Hegelian. This was the sort of thing that led to this falling out between the two Ivans. So have a little look at the story of the two Ivans, because I kind of want to come back to it later on when I'm going to talk about a little bit of the 1970s and how Henri Lefebvre and Louis Althusser actually tried to meet each other and come together around the union of the left that was in motion in the 1970s in France. So I'll come back to that with the story of the two Ivans in mind. Now have a look at Gogol, because it's comic, but there's a lot of profundity in there, which is quite hilarious. And right at the end of the story, Gogol says, in the end, this world is very gloomy, gentlemen. And when close friends can't actually talk to each other and find some agreement, the world does become a little bit gloomier. So that is the sort of moral message that Gogol, I think, is trying to tell us. And I suppose Freud would have called it the narcissism of minor difference. But that's another story. Let me just say something about Althusser and about Henri Lefebvre. Now, it's hard to know, talking to myself and talking to a screen, just exactly what is known by the audience listening in of either person, and whether in fact the person listening might actually know more about them than I do. But I just don't know. But just in terms of these two Ivans, as it were, they did oddly have quite a lot of things in common. They were very different. It's true. They were a different generation, which I think is important. Henri Lefebvre was born just at the opening of the 20th century, 1901. And Louis Althusser was born in 1918, just at the end of the First World War. So there's a 17-year age gap. And I think what they had in common was both men were scarred by war. Henri Lefebvre was scarred by the Great War. He was young, but he was old enough to understand what was going on. Louis Althusser was scarred by the Second World War, where in fact he was held in captivity in a German camp for 5 years. So they were both scarred by war. They both joined the Communist Party, the PCF, the French Communist Party, in their 20s. Henri Lefebvre in 1925, after the Great War, and Louis Althusser joined the French Communist Party in 1948, immediately after the Second World War. Althusser jokes that before that he was quite a militant Catholic, involved in the Catholic youth groups. He saw the militant resistance fight, or he knew of them. He was held captive, but he knew the bravery that went on with certain Catholic militants. And he always says that when he joined the French Communist Party, he didn't actually change religion. His religion of universality was continuing. His fraternity just got displaced into a different organization called the Communist Party. And so that was something that he said about the Communist Party. Henri Lefebvre joined in 1925. Both men in an odd sort of way, were outsiders, not only in the Communist Party, but they were outsiders in the Parisian intellectual scene as well. That might sound a little bit strange and somewhat questionable to say that, because it wasn't Althusser, he was a professor at the École Normale Supérieure, wasn't at the Grande École, and he was a very important figure in French intellectual life. Yes, but there is also a sense that as a pied noir, as somebody who was born in Algeria and came over, he did also feel somewhat of an outsider, as indeed did Henri Lefebvre, who was born in the southwest, a very modest stock, right, very near to the Basque border of southwest France, Pyrenean foothills. And he also felt like he was a marginal figure. And to some degree, I think Henri Lefebvre leveraged his outsiderness a little bit, perhaps more than Althusser did. He was more playful with his Marxism, where Althusser was a little bit more reclusive and internal and interior with it. Both men were very physically strong, costaud, as the French would say. Althusser apparently was a big man who was physically very strong. There was a discussion somewhere when a friend was watching him dig a garden, and the ferocity with which he could dig was quite amazing. He was a keen footballer when he was younger. Henri Lefebvre was a great walker. He used to walk in the foothills. He talks about walking from Florence to Siena as a young man because he was in love with a girl in Siena. And when he got there, he was the young woman had fallen out with him and wasn't interested in him anymore. So he had to kind of walk back. So they were both physically strong. They were both very passionate about three things. And it's nice to think that we were threatening, that people feel so threatened by what we're doing, I guess. It's maybe one consolation that these guys, have deep kind of concerns about what we're doing. So it would be nice if we were all in the same room, I guess, wouldn't it? It reminds me a little bit of the Woody Allen joke when they were talking about fascists coming in Brooklyn, and he said we should go down and have a real discussion with them. I think it was Annie Hall, the movie, and he said maybe we should go down with some baseball bats. It always works a little bit more effectively. So it's a little bit cowardly, isn't it, to do it this way? But it's it's a backhand compliment in a perverse sort of way, I guess. So anyhow, can
you remember where you were, Andy?
I can remember where. Yeah, no, I can. I don't. I hope I'm not coming across too pedantically, I'm trying to sort of give lecture. I felt like I was lecturing another sort of Woody Allen. The beginning of Manhattan when he says, too serious. You've got to sell some books here. You're too earnest. I was just going on a little bit too deeply, but I just wanted to pick up a little bit on the biography of the two people, of Henri Lefebvre and Louis Althusser, because who they were and where they came from was so important. They both had a peculiar relationship with Hegel, as a lot of you will surely know. Henri Lefebvre's apparent first encounter with Hegel was a couple of years before he joined the Communist Party. The French Communist Party was in 1925, when he was with André Breton at André Breton's the surrealist André Breton's studio in Rue Fontaine, and there was a very weighty tome on one of the tables of André Breton's working desk, and Henri Lefebvre said to him, what's this? And Breton typically was very condescending, even though he wasn't much older than Henri Lefebvre. He was quite condescending. And this is Hegel. Don't you know it? Have you not read The Science of Logic? Hegel's big logic. And Henri Lefebvre said no. And he said, take it away. Go and read and come back. And so that was his first encounter with Hegel, was via André Breton in 1925. And he was very much connected with the surrealists in that time. And it's perhaps quite easy to see where Hegel would have come into it in terms of somebody who had already read Marx, was a surrealist. Surrealists, of course, were into the unconscious desires. Karl Marx was into practical politics and, in some ways, conscious practice. But Hegel was into consciousness. So Hegelian thought was very much the link that Henri Lefebvre needed as a young man between surrealism, the surrealism that he never really left behind, and Marxist thought. And of course, that was redoubled in the 1930s when the economic and philosophical manuscripts became public. And this really set Henri Lefebvre's Marxist thinking alive with his discovery. And he was one of the first to translate Hegel into French with a colleague called Norbert Gutermann. They worked together translating Hegel and produced some books of Hegelian writing. And they also translated the economic and philosophical manuscripts, and were very much struck by what was seen as the Hegelian Feuerbachian moment in the early Marx, and it struck as a revelation. And of course, Louis Althusser was very much steeped in Hegel. He effectively did a doctorate under the watch of the philosopher Gaston Bachelard on Hegel, on the content of the content in the thought of Hegel, essentially was what he was writing about. So he knew his Hegel. He knew his Hegel well. He wrote a doctorate on Hegel, and yet he seemed to fall out with Hegel en route in a way that Henri Lefebvre never did. Now, in terms of what Lefebvre took from the economic and philosophical manuscripts were questions of something that which figured even in his urban writings, were questions of species being, and the idea of the so-called total man that comes in that section in the EPM on private property and communism, when one is talking about species being, the question under capitalism is one of alienation, estrangement, it was called in the EPM, and some form of disalienated human would release vital powers around particular forms of species being, and they would realize and affirm a kind of integral essence, integral human essence, as the young Marx was called it. And they would actually become an all-rounded, all-conscious being that would be seen as the total, called the total man. And this was a concept that Lefebvre mobilized in terms of an urban setting much later in his life. But they were very struck by questions of alienation, questions of species being, and this idea of integral essence of human beings and human capacity, all of which Althusser hated with a passion. He never liked the idea that there was any integral human essence. The idea that notion of species being would throw a blanket over questions of class, questions of class struggle, that it was an ideology that obfuscated rather than actually clarified the thought of Marx. And this was where his reliance a little bit on what he'd learned with Bachelard, because Bachelard was the first to affirm an epistemological break. And this was what Althusser utilized to suggest there was an epistemological break in Marx, the writings after 1845. There was an interim period up until the German ideology when Marx had already left Hegel behind and became a Feuerbachian, but they were still ideological. And this split around the early humanist, idealist, ideological Marx has given way to the more mature thinking And I think with that went the question of alienation. Althusser didn't like the notion of alienation. The only place he spoke about alienation favorably was with his courses on Rousseau that he taught in the mid-1960s. About individual alienating their own capacity to the greater general will. But other than that, he was very anti the questions of alienation. He hated species being. He hated the teleology that he saw in Hegelian thought. He basically disliked the idealism that was there, suggesting that the real core notion in Marxist thought was not idealist, but one quote he liked to use a lot in reading Althusser was a quote from Lenin, when he spoke about the idea that what Lenin said about Marx, that the very gist of Marxism, the living soul, according to Lenin, was the concrete analysis of a concrete situation. And for Althusser, questions of species being and even estrangement and alienation were metaphysical and hence ideological. And they were rejected by Althusser. Althusser rejected those wholesale, and he threw down the gauntlet with his readings of Marx, particularly teaching Marx to his students at ENS, the École Normale Supérieure, in his course Lire le Capital, reading Marx in the mid-1960s. And this was very much creating an object, a different object, an object that was an anti-humanist object. That actually questions of species being were ideological, that the struggle for Marxism was a struggle between classes, that the struggle for Marxism was about class exploitation and discovering democracy for the working classes. It wasn't in any way about affirming individual freedom. It wasn't in any way about overcoming alienation in that sense. So this then gets us back to the sort of two Ivans throwing missives at each other. Henri Lefebvre's writing is full of pejorative stuff against Althusser. He just clearly doesn't like Althusser. He calls Althusser variously a dogmatist, a Stalinist. They see there's a cult of the dialectics of nature. It's evacuating any form of human agency from Marxist thought. That the idea that history is a process without a subject is ridiculous. So there was a lot of ways in which this did became a fully fledged war. The problem with anti-humanism was it was dogmatic. Althusser responded to say that the problem with humanism was that it was actually there was a little bit too much human agency, and it actually gave rise to the cult of personality. So in a way, I would argue that a lot of Henri Lefebvre's criticisms of Althusser in his books were surprisingly glib and surprisingly unfair. Actually, the idea that one would call Althusser a Stalinist was I just find quite extraordinary. One reads Althusser to see what he has to say about Stalin and how critical he is about him and how critical he is about the cult of personality and about how Marxism was the humanist argument was actually a form of ideology that gave rise to a form of cult of personality. He also suggested, that if you read Marx, you'll find all ideas that humans make their own history, but they don't make it under conditions of their own choosing. He cites the famous preface to the contribution to Critique of Political Economy, that it's not about individual will, it's about one's rapport with the basic relations of production, productive forces. So it's masses make history, according to Althusser. That there's a motor to history, but actually there's the individual agency there is not. So this humanism, anti-humanism debate really did fracture a lot of Marxism that went on. that boats the question that if you read Henri Lefebvre's books, of which there are very many, I have to say, he's reputed to have published about 68, I think. I've counted about 68. There's probably more, and that doesn't include any kind of numbers of translations of them or new prefaces that he wrote for them. But he was a prolific writer. Often he dictated his books, so there's a flow. Very often he leaves things dangling in one book and says he will come back to it in another, which he never does. Sometimes one wonders whether he gets carried away with his own spontaneity, which he was very much an adherent of, and whether in fact his Marxism was becoming more anarchistic. And somebody once said, "Hey, aren't you really an anarchist?" And he said, "No, I'm a Marxist, so that one day we can all become anarchists." And of course, in the interview with Althusser, there's his only TV interview was done in 1980 on Italian TV, and he says that he's a social anarchist. It's more progressive than communism. So both of them were playful around this idea of anarchism. Althusser's books were numerous. He wrote more than one thing. So there's been a whole slew of posthumous books published over the last decade. Althusser died in 1990. His professional life was pretty much finished when he had, how can one say, he strangled his wife, Hélène, who was a very big influence, Hélène Rietmann, in what is seen as a temporary act of insanity. He spent the final decade of his life going in and out of a sanatorium. He moved and he lived, oddly enough, he rented an apartment just next door to Père Lachaise Cemetery in the 20th arrondissement in Paris. And he said out the window he could see the Mur des Fédérés, which is where the communards were set up and executed. So Althusser's own thinking around Marx were mainly set down in very tight essays. His essays were very short. They were very concise. They were shorn of any frills. Henri Lefebvre would be writing books and books and books, and he was much more poetic in his language. Although I always think there's a great poetry in the simplicity and the clarity of Althusser. I found him an extremely poetic, a beautiful writer, actually, just as good as Henri Lefebvre. But the ways in which they were communicating it within the party were essentially very critical of what was going on in the party. Henri Lefebvre left the French Communist Party after 1956. He always says that he left it via the left wing rather than the right after 1956, where a lot of other ex-communists tended to veer towards the right as when they left. Well, Henri Lefebvre says, "J'ai quitté par la gauche," and he left by the left wing. Louis Althusser stayed in the party all his life, even though he was a big critic of it, particularly in the 1970s. So Lefebvre was in it. He left. Lefebvre suggests he left. He was expelled, but he's very playful in terms of whether he says he was expelled. He was expelled, but he always says he expelled himself, and he left himself. And if you can read many interviews when he says he was expelled. Other interviews says he decided to quit himself. So the person who's just put the comment up, I accept that, but it's a little bit of a contested terrain, just exactly what was what. It was clear that ideologically he fell out with the party, not necessarily because of his humanism, and I think that Garaudy's humanism, Roger Garaudy took over the humanist side of the party. It wasn't necessarily because of his humanism. I think it was a lot of it to do because he was some of his more romantic writings, and he went off into literature, And he was writing about things that he wasn't meant to write about as a Marxist. He started to write about everyday life in the 1940s. In the 1960s, he started to write about urban life. And he was suggesting that actually, to understand capitalism in the modern age, one needed to understand not only everyday life, but one also needed to understand the urban process in the process of industrialization. That actually urbanization had become another form of industrialization, that it's another form of which capitalism produces space, produces surplus value, valorizes value, and actually grows. It accumulates through the way in which it orchestrates the city. And the city itself was becoming a site for different forms of class struggle. And, one has to remember this was the 1960s, and it's very clear to see how that was very much the case. And so Henri Lefebvre was writing about things which seemed rather wayward and slightly peculiar for more traditional Marxists. And in the 1970s, he began to write about space, which was essentially where I got to hear about him, because I was doing a PhD in geography in the 1980s, and I suddenly discovered that there was somebody, I was a Marxist, I was into Marx, and I just suddenly discovered that alongside David Harvey, there were other people writing about space, and one of those was Henri Lefebvre. There were other people writing about the city that were using Althusser, and Althusserian thought was really important then too, particularly in more classical forms of Marxism, particularly in Latin America. I think what separates Althusser and Henri Lefebvre out in a certain sense was that Henri Lefebvre never really was developing Marxism with inside it. He took Hegel, he took Hegelian Marxism, he took some ideas about Marx, and he put them in motion with defining a particular kind of object, whether it be the city, whether it be everyday life, whether it be space. Later on, it became citizenship. And he was an innovative utilizer of Marx. He wasn't necessarily innovative Marxist in terms of what he did with Marxist thought and Marxist writings. Some of his writings on the city they actually deign to Engels, unsurprisingly. He obviously mentions that Marx didn't write a great deal about the city. There are some fragments. He wrote about the commune, but he didn't write about the city. In chapter 25 of Capital, on the general law of capitalist accumulation, we talk about towns and the redevelopment of towns. He kind of hints at gentrification. So it's clear that he was using Marx in a very original and a very, very imaginative way that didn't lend itself well with the party. And meanwhile, Althusser was developing Marx in his own very original and very, quite for many people, quite wayward way in some of the things that he was saying, in terms of rejecting the early Marx, in identifying the epistemological break, in terms of defining history as a subject as a process without a subject, coming up with some quite bold comments about Marx. Even his preface to Volume 1 of the French edition of Capital suggests that one shouldn't begin at the beginning, but one should begin with Section 2. One should leave aside all the stuff on value, all the stuff on exchange value, all the stuff on equivalent and relative forms of value, which Althusser actually was very skeptical about, including the fetishism of commodities. And one should begin with part 2, with the transformation of money into capital. And once you've got to the end, finished part 8, then come back and begin at the beginning, which always struck me as a bit odd. I can't imagine what it must be like reading about, in Capital, hearing about value and exchange value and use value and money and equivalent forms of value, and seeing how they're mobilized, and actually not knowing what that is when you're reading, sort of 800 pages, having to come back to it. It seems a very odd thing, but it was in some way in some way consistent with his notion that those early chapters had residues of Hegel. They were they were coquetted in terms of Hegelian thought. The fetishism of the commodity talks about metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties. It's clear that they jarred with Althusser's idea of Marx being a concrete analysis of a concrete situation. So the question then of what might we take from all this? I rather like Althusser in the age of pandemic, quite frankly. When you read his stuff on ideology as interpolation and as hailing and as being in some ways called upon to understand your class situation, that this question of hey you, and suddenly you turn this small little theater that Althusser suggested he constructed when he was talking about his famous essay on the ideological state apparatuses, is that interpolation just seems to me something that one could develop a little bit more in the age of, can we say post-Trump, when there have been a lot of working class people who have been interpolated, hey you, and they've responded in certain ways to certain ideological callings. And it's important that Althusser didn't see this question of ideology being about false consciousness. Henri Lefebvre spoke about mystified consciousness in the 1930s, how a big portion of the German working class voted for Hitler in 1933. And he used this idea of mystified consciousness. Althusser suggests that one's relationship with ideology is rather an imaginary representation to one's real conditions of life, as he calls it. And it's not to suggest that ideology is false. It's suggesting that it has a real content. So there was, can we bring alienation into this? There are 71 million Americans who are alienated and actually vulnerable for ideological interpolation by various demagogues. Althusser warned about demagogy, as Lenin did. The idea that somehow inciting one's passions, one's unthinking feelings, that the question of rebel rousing was not what Althusser really liked in that sense. He had certain problems with 1968 because of that, because of its spontaneity. Henri Lefebvre was praising the spontaneity of it. But one could suggest that thinking in the way in which Althusser talks about ideology and about how one can resist it if that is possible. In my essay that I wrote, I had a little dabble with Bertolt Brecht, talking about Brechtian theatre. And the idea that I was trying to mobilize then, try to think about was, is there a way in which working class people, ordinary people, almost everywhere now, where demagogy is rife, where people are stirring up emotions that really are preying on their passions rather than their idea of a certain kind of reason? Is there some way that we can get that alienation effect, to get some critical distance on what we're being told in social media, what we're being told on the news? Can we get cool-headed analysis back? Is there a role for a more anti-humanism that isn't talking about freedom? Because freedom has to be one of the biggest ideological constructs today when everybody talks about freedom. Marx was always pillorying freedom, free trade, free will, freedom to be a consumer, all the kinds of things that we read in Marx, and how Marx was actually quite skeptical of freedom. And perhaps, we should be too, where it's now used in a very loaded way, in a very ideological way. that we can cut through it and be a little bit more clinical in the way we analyze this now. And that really relates to the question of alienation. What is alienation? Is it something that's metaphysical? Can it be grounded a little bit more in terms of actual working conditions? So it's not necessarily about how people feel. There's a real objective situation about how they're exploited. Is it possible to reboot the question of alienation to make it less touchy-feely about being alienated from oneself, but just really being exploited because you're lowly paid or you're doing a job that really doesn't give you a lot of meaning? Is it possible that we can rethink ideas of alienation again in terms of something that's a concrete analysis of a concrete situation? And some of those things strike me as being fascinating to think about. And that bodes the question then about, is there any form of any kind of rapprochement between humanism and anti-humanism? Does it still matter? Does it just matter to us, Marxists talking amongst each other? I think it does matter for that. That reason is intellectually, I think, and politically important. But does it matter in terms of questions of strategy, questions of organization, questions of concrete analysis of concrete situations, questions of cooperation, questions of, could we have such a thing as a union of the left now, even though there isn't a party of the left that we could perhaps hook anything onto, as there was in the 1970s in France, in Althusser and Henri Lefebvre's day. Because it's interesting that during that period of the late 70s, and we can see the late 70s as being a moment when some of the possibilities of the late 60s evaporated. When 68, 1969, the hot autumn in Italy, and then on to the oil crisis of 1973, the fiscal crisis of the state, of many municipal governments, including New York, were bankrupt. The passage from what one spoke about as being from Fordism to post-Fordism, and seeing a real breakdown and a dislocation within traditional working class ranks that, of course, gave rise to the new right in the 1980s and the war against unionism and Margaret Thatcher's famous declaration, there's no such thing as society, only individuals, that it was a rupture. There was, if not an epistemological rupture in the 1970s, there was a real ontological rupture within the workers' movement and within Marxism. I've been looking at some archives of Althusser. Althusser's archives are in an organization called, an institute, it's called the IMEC. It's essentially a kind of public educational archive, which is based in an old abbey in Normandy, in northwest France, near Caen. And a lot of his papers have been collated and documented and filed away, and there's quite a few things online that you can look at. And I've been looking at some of his stuff. And one fascinating thing looking at Althusser is his book collection, because after he died, all his books, well, I don't know whether all his books, but a great majority of his books were taken over and actually documented. And what is incredible is the documentation is very thorough. It says whether the books are being annotated lightly or heavily, what's being read and where. And it also cites some of the dedications. And he has almost every one of Henri Lefebvre's books with a dedication by Henri Lefebvre, interestingly enough. And there's some fascinating things. One calls him his intimate enemy, which is an interesting dialectical construct in itself. An intimate enemy, somebody who seems to be an enemy yet is quite intimate, i.e. quite were quite close to each other. There's a lot of stuff reading some of the dedications. Some of his dedications are provocative. I've listed them all. They talk about having more wars around Hegel and anti-Hegelianism. There's often, sometimes he wants Althusser to prompt. There's one reference, there's one dedication that asked Althusser, he suggests, thanks for your letter, which obviously Althusser at some point in the 1960s had written to Henri Lefebvre. So there's a lot of material there, and there's some fascinating stuff. Actually, in 1984, Milan Kundera sent a copy of the Unbearable Lightness of Being to Althusser, suggesting that I've always been a fan of yours, and with great sincerity and best wishes. And this is Kundera, who was part of the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia in the 1960s, saying, one would think that he would not be a fan of Althusser, but anyhow, he sent a complimentary copy that was signed The Unbearable Lightness of Being to Althusser. So there's a lot of material in there which is fascinating. There's one other piece of material which, and this is where I kind of want to end, I think. And this was a letter that I discovered, or it was found for me, I have to say, by an Italian researcher. And it was a letter that Henri Lefebvre had sent to Louis Althusser on the 5th of June 5, 1978. One of Althusser's most important pieces of writing in the 1970s, I think, one of his many, I have to say, were 4 articles that he wrote in the French daily Le Monde around the questions of the collapse of the union of the left, and about the French Communist Party and what was wrong with the French Communist Party and what needed to change in the French Communist Party. What couldn't last was the title of his article. And Le Monde published on the dates of 25th, 26th, 27th, and 28th of April 1978. There were 4 successive articles, very long pieces, filled the whole broadsheet of stuff that were about the French Communist Party and about what it was doing wrong under Georges Marchais' leadership, presidency. And the truly fascinating articles. New Left Review in May, June of the same, almost a month after the Le Monde had published it, New Left Review had translated all these articles and put them together in one piece in New Left Review number 109 for anybody interested in reading it. And it's incredible that Althusser had written something about the French Communist Party. New Left Review thought it was important enough to translate it and have it published themselves a month later in their magazine, New Left Review. It's kind of amazing to think that some of these debates were going on. It was in response to those series of articles that Henri Lefebvre wrote to Althusser. This is just my rather clumsy translation. He said, "Dear Louis Althusser," and this is dated June 5, 1978. "After returning from a long trip abroad, I read your articles. I find them remarkable, coming at the right time, and I approve of them. In my opinion, it would justify a meeting between us, which can only be fraternal. But there is more. In recent times, given on the one hand enterprises of the right and the operation of the new philosophers, and on the other hand, the possibilities of openness that appear inside the PC, the French Communist Party, the theoretical situation seems to me modified. The separation between the epistemological tendency and the critical tendency in Marxist thought loses, in my opinion, its raison d'être. A rapprochement, a reunification, and a work in common couldn't be more timely. I do not believe, as far as I'm concerned, that there are unsurmountable obstacles and incompatibilities between what I consider the 2 complementary aspects of Marxist thought at this time. It would be a great pleasure in several ways to meet up with you and receive you for lunch or dinner at my home. I live and work with Catherine Régulier, a member of the party, who joins with the greatest interest in this invitation, not with our hopes Henri Lefebvre. The next day, the mail was good in those days. This is 5th of June, and the Althusser's response is June 6. Dear Henri Lefebvre, I am very touched by your letter. You know, I always held you in great esteem, and also for the trials that have been inflicted upon you with great fraternal affection. I would be happy to see you. I'm a little surprised that your invitation is accompanied by considerations of an historical nature, as if we needed permission from history to see each other. For the rest, I'm afraid you'll have some illusions, but in the end, each to his own. For me, I try to perceive mine. Fraternally, Louis Althusser. Althusser uses the two form, the informal form, in his response. Henri Lefebvre is using the more formal vous form in French, which is in itself quite interesting to see. I contacted an ex-student of Althusser this week, Etienne Balibar, to ask him, had he ever seen that response? And he said he hadn't, and he was amazed about it. And I asked him, did the meeting ever happen? He thinks not, because at the time, Henri Lefebvre had just got married to a young woman, a young communist, Catherine Regulier, clearly who was much more Althusserian than Henri Lefebvre himself. Catherine Regulier and Henri Lefebvre wrote a book together about what has to change in the revolution. The revolution wasn't what it used to be, was the English title of their book, which was a series of dialogues between a young communist militant, i.e. Catherine, and Henri Lefebvre. And she is much more amenable to Althusser. So one wonders whether it was Catherine's idea to reach out to Althusser. But Balibar doesn't think it happened because Althusser was in and out of various psychiatric institutions in that part of his career. So the meeting was unlikely to have happened. Interesting to think about it in terms of this union, because it almost suggests that that philosophically the differences were less than the actual essences, if you want to use that word. We perhaps shouldn't use it in the context of anti-humanism, but there were more similarities and more possibilities to find some kind of rapprochement between the two forms of Marxism, that the moment might have been right when there was so much disunity, and the left was up against the right with such force. In his Le Monde pieces, Louis Althusser suggests that the PC, the French Communist Party, needed to develop much more of a democratic centralism. That he was very much a verticalist, if you want to call it that. The organization was vertical, not necessarily horizontal, but it had to have a democratic, that the party had to be relating to the party leadership. And Marchais was much more interested in holding on the grip of the PCF vis-a-vis the Socialist Party, that he actually forgot there was a right-wing opposition. And it's the notion that there had to be more. There had to be much more openness and transparency with the rank and file, the party rank and file, with the top dogs. So the democratic socialism, the democratic centralism had to be worked through much more thoroughly in terms of a dialogue with the party members. And in the end, he suggested that the party had to come out of its fortress. He cites Machiavelli, that when you tend to build fortresses and walls around yourself, you imprison yourself. You might keep an enemy out, but you also imprison yourself. And at the time, reading Henri Lefebvre's dialogue with Catherine, and this is where I want to end, Henri Lefebvre is talking about autogestion, which is a form of self-management. So it's clear that he has involved what we see today as much more of a horizontalism, a la Tony Negri, perhaps, in terms of the more decentralized, communal types of organization that spread much more horizontal. So it does bode the question then about, is it possible to actually bring those two camps together in some way? We don't have a party, but we have a fragmented left almost everywhere. We have we have people who believe in horizontalism. We have maybe members of, people who believe actually that a much more structured verticality, centralism is much more important. I tend to go for the more Althusserian side personally myself in terms of it. But is there any way in which there could be some dialogue between the two? Can the two Ivans talk to each other in this very gloomy world that we live in today? I probably said too much, so why don't I just stop there? I hope that was okay.
Michael, I think you are mute.
I've muted because that hacking was so disruptive. But thank you everyone for coming back following that terrible experience. And thank you very much, Andy. I did put in the chat that if you have a question or comment, to write the word stack over here. And we have Kevin Anderson right away with a question. So go ahead, Kevin, we'll take yours and one more, and so that Andy can address more than one at a time. So it'll be you, Kevin, and then David Worley, and then another round after that. Go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, a wonderful talk, very illuminating. I mean, I've wrestled with both of these two thinkers for, God, 40 years.
I know. Nice to meet you, Kevin.
Nice to meet you. Yeah, just one point that I think you were hinting at, but I want to just make explicit, which is these are two, they're real intellectuals, obviously, but they also spent most of their adult life in organizations, in fact, a top-down organization, the Communist Party of France, and just the difficulty of that, because they didn't, I mean, there's plenty of times I'm sure that Lefebvre could have quit between 1925 and 1959, and Althusser before 1978, because they realized that we need organizations at the same time that we need serious intellectual theorizing. I think Gramsci said the truth is revolutionary, and they saw that. I mean, as you know, I'm much more toward Lefebvre than Althusser, but I just wanted to throw that in. I think you would agree with it.
Yeah.
And maybe it's even part of autobiographies of a lot of people in the room. Some of those dilemmas.
David?
I suppose I'll get back to that. I've got something to say. It's a very thoughtful question. It's a very good one.
Hi, great presentation. Thank you. Very interesting. I have to say I have not. I have read Lefebvre basically only the Critique of Everyday Life, and I tried to read Althusser when Four Marks and Reading Capital came out in English, and I don't know when it was, 1970 or 60, around then anyway, when I was just sort of becoming a Marxist anyway. I found I really couldn't get through them, and I thought some reviewer at that time said Four Marks should have been titled Against Marx, and that was kind of my impression too, but I never really put my finger on it until years later when I read E.P. Thompson's attack on Althusser, The Poverty of Theory, which I don't know if you're familiar with it, but probably are. Yeah. Sure. And I was so taken by his little diagram of the orrery, as he called it, the mechanical thing that Althusser somehow thought was how history works, and his quite bitter rejection of the notion of history as not having a subject. And so I just wondered if you could maybe say something about about Thompson's
Sure.
critique of Althusser, and also the problematical idea that somehow history is a process without a subject.
Okay.
Well, between Kevin and David, that's a lot. I know, Andy. So we'll take another round after.
It's great. Shall I go for those?
Yes.
In terms of the Communist Party, I suppose it gives a certain structure to one's life, doesn't it? What Althusser said about he didn't change his religion. He just sort of shifted it somewhat. It's a form of fraternity and camaraderie, and some form of solidarity, and it's a gel that perhaps they were just reluctant to release. They wanted that gel, and even though they were both mavericks, Henri Lefebvre much more was a maverick who played with the party. Althusser was just trying to develop Marxist theory in a very, very deep and intense way, which was a bit hot to handle for a lot of the members, I think, including the leadership, who were much more involved in pragmatism rather than developing theory. But I think just simply it just gave them a sense of that they weren't alone in what they were doing. It was a club that they belonged to, that perhaps even though they didn't want to be members, it wanted them as members in a strange kind of reverse of the Groucho Marx joke. That they did want them in the party because they were quite well known. They were very well known intellectuals on the left, and it seemed that it was the right home for them. It was the right doorbell to ring on in case they got locked out. And I think both of them were reluctant to, particularly Henri Lefebvre was reluctant to quit. But obviously after 1956, it became. I mean, he did trips to the Soviet Union, and he saw things, and he was obviously very critical of Stalin. He hated dialectical materialism, and his own dialectical materialism was historical dialectical materialism of Stalin. When Henri Lefebvre's own rejoinder was with his book Dialectical Materialism, which he published, I think, in 1936, very early on. So it was a doorbell to ring on that they were coming home, and they were reluctant to actually turn away from it. So that's probably how I would think about answering that question about the party. The second one about E.P. Thompson is I could go on at length, I suspect, and I don't want to, but E.P. Thompson was the condition, the making of the English working class. It's somewhere around my bookshelf. It's just is a gorgeous book, which I cite in my latest book when he's talking about the Luddites and about rescuing a certain contingent from posterity, from the whatever he says, from the curses of posterity. He rescues them, and his historical text and some of his research were brilliant. He was one of the founders of New Left Review with Stuart Hall and Perry Anderson and a host of other people, and Tariq Ali. But it has to be said that when it came to Althusser, he really kind of got it wrong. He really got it wrong. And that has been said by quite a few people. One of the interesting pieces written about E.P. Thompson was Stuart Hall. Stuart Hall died several years ago, and before he died, he wrote a memoir, a very touching memoir called, I think it's called Strange Migrants. And it's a beautifully written book. Stuart Hall's a brilliant guy, and he talks mainly about growing up in Jamaica, and he talks then about being a student at Oxford. But he does talk, not as much as I was hoping he would talk, but he does talk nonetheless about his relationship with Perry Anderson and E.P. Thompson, and the founding of New Left Review in 1960. And he says that he had real kind of problems relating to E.P. Thompson because he was kind of so English. He was so Franco, familiar stranger, thank you very much. I knew it was something like that. He had real problems relating to E.P. Thompson because E.P. Thompson was so goddamn English, essentially, is what Stuart Hall was saying. He was still very much a little Englander, I think is the word he used. He had a real phobia for continental thought. Perry Anderson pretty much says the same, and of course Perry Anderson was the complete opposite. He was a complete internationalist. He knew Althusser. In fact, there was a short piece a couple of years ago in New Left Review when Althusser came to visit the offices of New Left Review in Soho in 1977. So they were very much part of Althusser, and actually Stuart Hall really found some kind of calling in Althusserian thought because of his feeling of dislocation coming from the Caribbean and being a black British writer and having to live in a world which for him was always quite strange. And he was able to identify a little bit more with Althusserian thought. He's written some very nice essays on Althusser, actually. And he does say that, unfortunately, E.P. Thompson just got Althusser wrong. What did he get wrong? Well, it's clear that Althusser some of his language can be a bit provocative. You know, history is a process without a subject. You think, what on earth can they going to be on about? But if you read it closely and you try and get a sense of what he means, it is just marks of the 18th Brumaire. You know, humans make their history, but they don't make it under conditions chosen by themselves. They make it under conditions that are inherited, encountered, and transmitted by the past. It's that in a kind of nutshell that we're not free agents to do with free will. We belong to certain classes. We're subjects of a certain society. We relate to institutions, all of which have a much bigger sway on us than we do on them. And so when you get into it, the language is clearly provocative, and I think he knew he was being provocative with his language, but it isn't exactly what it might seem when you start to read about it. And of course, Althusser himself, toward the end of his life, came up with an aleatory, a contingent form of materialism. He hated teleology. You know, most of Capital was talking about historicism and teleology. He hated it with a venom. So the idea that it was an ordinary kind of scenario where people were just deterministically going around a particular orbit without being able to change it is frankly kind of nonsense. And it's I'm not the only one who said that, but E.P. Thompson was brilliant, but he just got continental thought, and particularly continental French theory, just kind of, in my opinion, just hideously wrong.
So we have Peruse and John Hammond. So Peruse, your question, please, and then we'll go to John. You need to unmute, Peruse.
Just a brief statement and the questions. Thank you, Andy, for your excellent presentations. I'm actually more on the side of the continental thought. I think one should come outside of their own national countries. In that respect, I was just wondering why the French left in general, similar to the Iranian left, never foresaw the implications of Ayatollah Khomeini. And speaking of Michel Foucault as the heir to that intellectual tradition, publishing works in Le Monde and in Corriere della Sera in 1973, at a time when the Iranian women had come and opposed his position. And he endorses the Islamic Republic of Iran. The critique on the Persian left is all valid, but where was the French left on that? The theory and the practice.
No, good question. A good question. I don't know. Foucault took a strange turn sometimes, didn't he? I don't want to really talk about Foucault, but it's clear that that 1970s period, that clearly there was a blindness to what was going on outside. I suspect they maybe thought they had their hands full with what was going on in France. I don't know. I haven't got an answer. I don't know. I suspect I suspect you probably, do you have any sense of why that might be?
It's a very long discussion. Yes, of course.
Yeah, I'm sure it is.
It's
I've got some, yeah, I've got some ideas about it as well, but the Foucault. There was a lot going on there. There was a lot going on with the sort of what was going on in the Middle East with Palestine, and we could put a lot of people. We could put Deleuze and Guattari into it, and Jean Genet, and we've got a whole kind of narrative, which is a long story. But in the short and narrow of it is, I don't know why. I don't know why. Why they maybe were blinded by that. Maybe they didn't want to go there after experiences in Algeria. I don't know. I'm not sure.
So, John Hammond and then Michael Dola, please. Go ahead, John.
Okay, I'm actually Jack, although in print I'm usually John, but when I'm live I'm usually Jack. In any case,
Sorry, Jack.
in any case, Andy, thank you for a very interesting set of reflections. And I have to say that in reading the two essays that we referred to before your talk, and also hearing your talk, and especially maybe the last comments on Althusser and E.P. Thompson, I find myself coming at all of this with a whole bunch of questions about where we are today. And what does this whole question of humanism versus anti-humanism, or agency versus structure, how should that inform our own work, our own political work? I think we're in a very bleak time.
Yeah.
I think our prospects, both not only politically, but also, of course, in terms of the future of life on the planet as a consequence of potential environmental disaster, makes me and a lot of people I know very, very pessimistic and really uncertain as to what degree do we have agency, to what degree can we think in terms of humanity as a subject whose future we care about, and then what can we do, what kind of political action can we pursue? And you're the man on the podium today. It's perhaps unfair to ask you to come up with an answer to these questions, but I would certainly be interested in your own reflections in relation to what you've been talking about.
Sure.
Andy, I'd like to get Michael Dola's comment too, so that you can take two at once. So Michael Dola, you're next. Are you still here?
Yeah, sorry, Mike. I'm still here. Thank you. Thank you for the presentation, Andy. I guess I was curious. I need to become more familiar with what Althusser actually wrote. The same as people who are Marxists and don't read Marx. I think even if I kind of have an antipathy for the glosses that I hear and more in-depth presentations like from you, I would love to get some recommendations on what you think would be a good place to start with Althusser. And I just want to say I think the Lefebvre and other humanists inflected Marxism, it speaks to me, for example, because it's sort of like not obviously a blueprint, but it has more to say, I think, about where we want to go, what a vision of a different society would be. And as Marx was just talking about in Capital, like it's a society where, what is it, the full and free development of every individual is the ruling basis of society. I mean, the individual seems to be a key here, and I'm just kind of like missing what Althusser thought was possible. It seems to me like these are theorists, whether it's the Frankfurt School or Althusser, theorists of retrogression and defeat, and that has its place. And I don't subscribe to this sort of teleology, but I don't know that Hegel even did either. That there was counter-revolution from within the revolution, and all that stuff. So thanks again. A very thoughtful presentation, and I'll be interested to read more. Thanks.
All right, Andy.
Well, great questions. Hard, difficult. You know, the first one. You know, it's. I mean, we're talking. I've been talking about things which are over 40 years ago. You know, which isn't that long ago, I suppose. But it's long enough. The reason I say that is that you have to, I suppose, in terms of keeping hope alive, one has to think more long waves about these things. That who would have believed that, you know, the Communist Party a sort of decade on would have just, you know, disintegrated, and, you know, the Eastern Bloc would have just collapsed, and all historic events, you know, that have happened since, nobody could have, you know, anticipated it in any way at all. And by the same token, we can't anticipate what might be people thinking in 40 years' time, if ever they recorded some of this and listened to these guys talking about, you know, humanism and anti-humanism, when, you know, New York is kind of full of water, and most of the, you know, climate change has done its bit. But it's hard to know in terms of what the I like to think that history is open and it is contingent. And, you know, looking at long waves of history in terms of pandemics, just even looking at pandemics, is that afterwards, strange things have happened when society's been rebuilt. You know, you can think of sort of bubonic plague in Renaissance, you know, Italy in the 14th century, but, you know, there was Dante, then the whole Renaissance, you know, a couple of hundred years later, there was Machiavelli, there was Leonardo da Vinci, you know, there was Galileo, there was this. One has to hope that there's things going on in terms of long wave movement. When it comes to climate change, it strikes me as being the classic idea of history as a process without a subject, because not one of us, not a single person, can do anything about it. You know, we can't change it. We can only change it as a collectivity, and so the idea of human agency around climate change doesn't seem like it's posing the right question. Maybe I'm saying something which is a little bit out of line. It's a question about our collective destinies, which is a little bit like the idea of, you know, we make history, but we don't make it under our conditions. And it's then a question of conditions. Is there going to be some objective breach? You know, are we sort of going to disintegrate? Are we going to be flooded with sea level rises? Are we going to be living in 50 degree temperatures? You know, do we have to adapt to those? So those objective conditions are going to sort of grip. You know, is the big volcano going to strike? How subjectively we can organize ourselves is you know, the humanist question would we organize ourselves as a species and do it as a collectivity around our humanity and our integral human essence, which is being destroyed. The anti-humanists might say, well, actually, some people are destroying it more than others. How can we organize around people who can stop people destroying it more than others? And so that the anti-humanists might actually make that argument that, you know, it's a collective enterprise, because personally I live quite a low level sort of fossil, you know, I don't think I'm the problem. And I'm doing my best to resolve the problem. But it strikes me that, you know, that the sort of the polluters will still be polluting. The plastic bags are still getting made. You know, the noxious fumes are still getting beamed out to the factories. That there has to be some way in which, as a collectivity, as a class, we can confront those who are actually doing the kinds of things that the perpetrators of what is going on. So there are ways in which the debates do resonate. You know, we are operating within long wave cycles. You know, we talk about Kondratiev cycles. There are cycles of resistance and struggle that go on within that, just as there are circulations of capital, there are circulations of struggle, and they are cyclical. And right now, clearly, it's not a good time. but it might change. That there may be a balance. That there may be some way in which things might change. There's plenty of people who are doing incredible things, all scattered around the world. It's a question of how. Is there any way that there can be some participation whereby they can kind of come together in some way? Is there any way that we can think of new organizations? Are there talks of new parties? I know Jeremy Corbyn's even hinted about starting a new party, something different from the Labour Party. It sounds all very small beer, but history is never a done deal. And it is an open process. It is an open process, even if it doesn't have an individual agent that's going to change it. It has a collective agent that's going to change it, and we can just do our best at trying to achieve a certain form of agency. But I'm adamant that it's not about collective humanity. Is not a failing. It's certain groups of people, certain ruling groups of people who, powerful, wealthy people who are the problem, and that remains to be seen how one addresses that. But it strikes me that there's still plenty of thought going on for Marxism, for Marxists. And I don't. Moving on to the second question, it relates to the humanism. Humanism has always resonated rather well in the United States because it's questions of sort of Declaration of Human Rights and the Constitution. The whole rights question seems a little bit more amenable to issues of individuality and freedom of speech, freedom not to sort of to give evidence against yourself, freedom to bear arms. The whole question of that idea of the humanist debate does actually resonate much clearer in the United States and perhaps elsewhere in the world. So and to some degree it works there. It works for certain people. It's worked for civil rights movement in the 1960s. It's in terms of Black Matters, there's a whole rights question. It's something that can't be evacuated. It's ridiculous to think one could evacuate the humanist argument. But the thing about anti-humanism is that it's not necessarily anti-human. It's not inhumane. It is about human beings collectively thinking about one's plight, and sometimes free questions of individual liberty aren't the debate. It's the questions about how to build a collectivity that can rebuild the public realm. How can one maybe relinquish one's rights? Obviously, one thinks about Althusser writing. Althusser gave a course on Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Social Contract in 1965, pretty much the same time he was teaching Capital to Balibar, Macheret, and various other people who became very, very well known subsequently. He was teaching Rousseau, and he talks about the social contract and about how one alienates one's rights to give it to the general will. But you can't relinquish your rights to a state which is undemocratic and is despotic, because it's a lesson for authoritarianism. So there's a way in which how do people as a collectivity relate to building a state? Sometimes actually talking about individual liberty can be an obfuscation, because we're trying to build a collectivity that can go beyond individual. We're trying to build, according to Rousseau, an association where people don't give up their liberty because they're building something which is much stronger. It's a collectivity that can guard those rights. But you have certain duties within that. But you're never going to give yourself up to a state, to a general will, if you believe that undemocratic. And in his course on Rousseau, he talks about it being a décollage, which is a kind of, it's a chicken and egg scenario. You can't have one without the other. But at least you can pose the question, and at least you can know in which environments one might be tweaked more than others. That the theory travels, but it doesn't travel completely everywhere, because everywhere has a particular context. And it's up to militants and organizers to understand the ways in which some of the languages around these discourses, if you want to call it, can resonate with people in different ways, just the same way that Donald Trump's, horrible discourses resonated with so many working class Americans. It's an imaginary representation, but there was something real in it for those guys that see this person as saving America, and making America great, and and believing that the election was rigged. They kind of believe it. It's not a myth to them. It's a belief, and there's these. We have theoretical armaments, as it were, and a theoretical infrastructure that can help us navigate the objective terrain, and we can use our brains to think about how we can, create certain subjective organizations around that can do stuff. I know I'm talking at a level of abstraction which is kind of idiotic, but I'm just trying to grapple with those questions, and I don't think that Althusser is a philosopher of defeat, even if he himself was a manic depressive, which wasn't actually caused by his Marxism, was caused by Catholicism. Marxism was the healthy strain of his psychology. It was Catholicism that really kind of damaged him, but that in itself is another conversation.
Yes, there may be more than one ex-Catholic in the Zoom room.
I can say that. Yeah, right.
So we have, Andy, how much, do you have enough energy for 3 more questions? We have 3 people on stack. If
you guys have got enough energy for me, then I'm very happy to try my best. If you're okay, if I'm not sort of, wearing you out.
We have 3 people on stack, and Fred Murphy had a comment that anti-humanism needs rebranding. What else can we call it? But that's Fred's comment.
I think that's good. I think that's good.
But we have on stack first Peter Bratzis, then Barbara Costa, then Michael Pelias. Then from that point, with your replies, Andy, we'll be past our stated time, but with the fact, I think that was, it looked and acted like a fascist hack. That did disrupt us a bit, but I am really happy to be in a Zoom room with people who are determined to stay and inquire and ask questions of each other.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely, Michael. Well said.
So Peter, you're first, then Barbara, then Michael, and we'll wrap up after that. So Peter, your turn.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Andy, for the talk and for bringing together. I mean, I've similarly been very influenced by both, and I agree with you that there are much more in common and things that are compatible than there are incompatible in the works of the two. But thinking about this question of Marxist humanism and philosophical anti-humanism, today we have, I think, is a new context for the discussion. On the one hand, I think practically the distinctions turned out to be not all that significant. For example, Alain Badiou, in his relatively recent work, very much comes up with a kind of humanist notion of what it is to be human, in a sense. It's a kind of, could come straight out of the 1844 manuscripts, much of what he says about being human. But in the context of questions of nature, which have reemerged, and some tendencies, the monthly review crowd, for example, going back to a kind of dialectics of nature, a kind of raising of nature as having some kind of a meaning, let's say, or existence beyond what human meaning. And on the other hand, things like the rise of veganism, the notion that there is no essence that is particular to humans, that all living beings are sentient, have the capacity for pain, and thus are some kind of equal footing. In this kind of context, what do you think is the significance of going back and evaluating these philosophical discussions of humanism and anti-humanism within Marx?
And Barbara.
Hi. Thank you so much for the wonderful lecture and for also carrying on after that very disturbing interruption. I have to admit that my question might be a little bit self-serving because I'm also in the urban studies department. So I wanted to take the opportunity. If it's veering off topic, then I can also just say that you can feel very comfortable to ignore me. But I wanted to ask about the idea. I wanted to ask your opinion on the whole question of whether it is industrialization or urbanization that drives capitalism, because that is famous David Harvey disagreed with that, right? In terms of in relation to Lefebvre, and this is now maybe a little bit too niche, but I think it's an interesting topic because as far as I understand, also a little bit of this comes from a sort of an influence of Maoist China, right, and the relationship between the town and country contradiction. And I have the impression that also, like, lately urban studies have been very much there's a big chunk of urban studies that's largely dominated by this idea of planetary urbanization, which is a development of Lefebvre, but sometimes I find it a little bit problematic in the way that it becomes a little bit undialectical, and I don't even think that that's how Lefebvre meant it. Yeah. The way that it's described, quickly, I found it here in an article. It says that somehow the definition of this planetary urbanization would be that it means these connected four processes: the disappearance of wild zones, 2, the global interconnectedness of territories, 3, the blurred division between town and country, and 4, the globalization of urban inequalities. And I always get the feeling that this turns the whole globe into a kind of world interior of the urban, with no dialectical opposition between, urban and non-urban, and like processes of urbanization, but also processes of de-investment and uneven development. And so that also ties in a little bit with a critique that is often made by the people at the monthly review. But anyway, this is maybe not really linked to the humanism, anti-humanism aspect, but since it's your field, I wanted to ask you.
It sounds like you've been reading my friend Neil Brenner.
Yeah, well, he's very much a big influence in my field. I'm an architect, and so he's a reference that keeps coming up all the time.
Sure.
So I don't know.
Thank you. I'm going to come back. It's noted, and I will try my best to answer those. Is there, Michael? Am I taking one more, or should I?
Actually, why don't you take Peter and Barbara and Jose, who I did not realize was on Stack. He and Michael, who was on Stack, can ask their questions, and then that will be it. But I guess we had a 15-minute disruption, but I don't want you to miss out on your evening, Andy.
The first question and the comments were very well said, and I just don't know whether I can add to what has been said, because it was said so well. Just in terms of questions of nature, the issue of sentient beings is a kind of humanism, but also questions of nature do bring the two together in strange ways, don't they? I know John Bellamy Foster talks about the metabolic rift, and using Marx and going into capital, and he's doing a brilliant job. And I know that John is very much what has been influenced by Althusser, but also the humanistic element in there is very clear too. So the old piece about veganism is clearly. The other thing is about that is that human beings are not necessarily carnivores as well. It's not some essential quality to human species being that we are meat eaters. So there's many ways you can take that, which I have to admit I hadn't completely thought about till they were raised today. But it does. I suppose it does go to what Fred said, is that one could maybe rebrand some of these things. The stumbling block somewhat is the metabolic rift is something different from an epistemological break. Now, actually, just to sever the two Marxes always did strike me as being a little bit clumsy in terms of thinkers, what I wrote when I was in my 20s is very different from what I'm writing now. Now, it's kind of the same person writing it with a bit more experience and a little bit better technique. And, is there something that's fundamentally different? I'm not sure there is in my own case. Obviously, people who've maybe, were on the left and then went to the right, there's a bit of a difference. But people who generally have been orbiting around the left, the distinctions between a form of humanism and questions of liberty, I do think that Alienation does need to be rebooted in a way which is a little bit more historical, that human beings are historical beings. We evolve, we change. What we're alienated from isn't necessarily from ourselves, but it's from particular activities that we do. We are certainly alienated from each other in particular ways, but that is mediated by kinds of institutions and the way in which various forms of capitalism were changed that have altered the labor process and our relations with people, and therein we have our relations with nature, which have changed as well. So it is a dialectic, and I think that the questions of alienation can be rebranded and rebooted in a way which can dislodge it from some particular humanistic moorings that see it as somehow human beings are already made. We're immutable, and we don't change and alter and develop our own capabilities and our capacities and our passions and our virtual powers, as Marx calls it. The idea that the senses become theoreticians in immediate practice, which is a citation from the EPM, it has to be put in an historical. It has to be historicized. It doesn't have to be necessarily taken as a once given. That we do adapt, and we do adapt to nature. So I haven't got a very good answer to that first question, because I think the answers were done very well within the question by the person who asked it, and I think it was very well said, and I do think that if we got away with using certain language of anti-humanism and humanism, we probably would be better off if we did actually just know that there's certain theoretical differences. But do we need to have very, very detailed philosophical debates about ontologies around stuff? I don't know. That's my fairly lame response to the question about reevaluating anti-humanism and humanism. The second one is also a biggie. It's a big thing because I've also written quite a few things on. I've written a book on planetary urbanization, actually, where I use Althusser and Henri Lefebvre, called The Politics of the Encounter. And I try not to lose the difference between the particular and the general. I suppose it's just saying that, all rivers are different. The Arno is different from the Seine, and it has a tremendous beauty, and it's surrounded by different kinds of wonderful buildings. But it still follows the general law of fluid dynamics, the way it flows, the molecules that go involved. So I think that the debates around planetary urbanization are trying to understand that actually, places that there exist around the world particular kinds of particularities that do constitute a generality. And sometimes trying to understand how places have things in common can be actually quite interesting, rather than saying how they're different. So certainly in urban studies, the world is, people who are involved in urban studies that I started out were either doing geography or sociology or psychology or anthropology. Occasionally, people who were looking at developing world cities were involved in development studies, and they were seen as two different camps. And the fact is that parts of London, Tower Hamlets, have lots of things in common with Johannesburg. Clearly, there were differences of degree, but in terms of being united by a particular orthodoxy that is a kind of globalized capitalism, it's just trying to maybe alter the balance to look at perhaps how the generality, how can we understand the generality rather than start off with the particularity. So there are ways in which, you know, you want to look at different. It's a different ways of seeing, if you like, a different way of theorizing about what the globe is, you know. And if you take a big look at it, and you see various electric forces and lights, they're scattered around everywhere. It's a kind of force field that connects all the globe together. It struck me as being quite a Marxist project, and it was, in fact. The debate has been kindled by some of the essays that Henri Lefebvre wrote toward the end of his life, particularly the one that Neil Brenner translated called "Dissolving Cities." I can't remember what it's. Quand la ville se perd dans un planétaire, dans un planet. I can't remember what it is in French either, but it was in. It was published in Le Monde, actually, in 1989, and he does talk about he talking about planetary urbanization. In fact, he talks about the planetarization of the urban. It's a different way that cities are becoming planet. Each city contains a bit of the globe. In the globe, the big cities contain a little bit of the globe, and as a collectivity, they form a totality, a form of global capitalism. Industrialization, urbanization, again, very much Henri Lefebvre, Right to the City, 1968. There's a chapter called that. Looking at the archives of Althusser, Henri Lefebvre sent Althusser a copy of Le Droit à la Ville, and it's been heavily annotated. And the chapter that's been the most heavily annotated is the chapter on industrialization, urbanization. And it's clear that it may have provoked, you know, it's beaucoup travaillé, I think it says, heavily worked. And it's clear that it's something in Althusser saw there. What, in a nutshell, for the uninitiated, because I know this is quite specific, is that it's clear that when we understand the capitalist city, we read Engels, you know, 1845, the condition of the working class in England, and you know, loosely, Marx loved it. It's a book talking about Manchester. It's talking about the factory city. Now, what Henri Lefebvre was basically saying in the 1960s is that it's not so much that the factory is still in the city. In the 60s it was. In the sort of 70s and 80s it kind of wasn't. It went elsewhere, it went to China. It's more actually that the city itself has become a factory. And, you know, the kinds of dynamics that go on, the producing infrastructure, labor, what goes on in precarious work, what goes on in, you know, the deliveries, the Uber Eats and all the rest of it, they're speeding around at great rapid speeds. You could easily sort of see that as a factory system, even though it's not in a factory. So there's ways in which you can see that there's been a shift whereby capitalism has become much more urbanized in the way in which it's producing growth. To the degree, according to Henri Lefebvre, that was always the case, that it was always the city that came first and then the industry. And then, in other words, that industrialization, and this is where he gets really provocative, like Althusser's History of That Process. He says that, you'll know this yourself, he says that industrialization was always a form of urbanization to begin with. It wasn't something that was a unique process of its own. It wasn't, you know, it wasn't something that was very. Capitalism has its own specificity of how it does it, but urbanization has always been a part of the breakdown of feudalism and the transition to capitalism, and the explosion of the city and the opening up of the world market was exploding sort of self-contained cities, and capitalism developed through doing something with cities, and then it was able to build factories, which then became industrialized capitalism that began to break down in the 1970s. And that's kind of his thesis in a nutshell. Does that kind of make any sense? I could go on about this for all night. it's just,
great.
and I'm sure you guys don't want to hear me anymore. So,
hey, Andy, we have Michael Pelias, and we also have Jose Faria, and I really want Jose to get a question in because At the beginning, I had trouble getting him into our meeting, and then we've all experienced this hack. So Michael Pelias, you will be first, and then Jose, you will be after Michael, and then we will conclude. Go ahead, Michael. You need to unmute, Michael.
I just did, yeah. I'll try to make it short. First of all, Andy, thank you very much for an extremely comprehensive, lucid account of the two of the greatest French Marxist philosophers, in our history. I wanted to just back up for a minute, based on the humanism, anti-humanism notion. To my mind, and having studied this for quite some period, that the humanist, anti-humanist debate started because of Jean-Paul Sartre's essay in 1946, Existentialism is a Humanism, to which Martin Heidegger replied in Letter on Humanism, where the anti-humanist epochal thinking, is really privileged, and this was taken up by a whole French group of philosophers, mainly Catholic philosophers like Jean Bouffray, who knew Althusser well, and Althusser certainly was very aware of this. And it seems to me, too, that this whole question of the humanist debate or the controversy really worked through Sartre in France. Very important to put him back into the mix with Lefebvre. In fact, Sartre in Search for a Method speaks of the progressive, regressive method of Henri Lefebvre.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to, throw in that little historical anchoring point that they were not the first two to really go through this debate, and it was pretty much framed by this. And also the whole question of the planetary organization and technology, as you probably well know too, was also the confrontation of planetary technology in our epoch. Again, Heidegger, Ernst Junger in Conservative Revolution, which we seem to relive in some ways in a very banal form, in my opinion, in the 1980s, 90s, and during the breakup of the Soviet Union. So, I know we could have this discussion in a much, broader and detailed way, but it seems to me that, again, Lefebvre, seemed to be the Sartrean in the mix, and Althusser, you probably know that there was a debate that I don't know if it's available between Althusser and Sartre on dialectics in 1960 that sort of made Althusser's reputation.
Yeah, that's right. He apparently destroyed that Sartre.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And this was part of the notion. I wanted to go to one other thing, and I'm just doing this, just as reference points for hopefully Marxist Educational Project, and also with the Institute for Radical Imagination. We can have these conversations in the future because I think they're important. When you mentioned the reading capital group, I think the question there was really the question of reading. How do we read? That Althusser brought into another dimension that Lefebvre never really went towards, which was the psychoanalytic, and especially, in Althusser's case, the return to Freud through Lacan. Right? And how do we read differently? And it seems to me that reading capital was really a strategy of reading, as well as being, of course, an organizational problem, but it opened up a whole new moment, including the Derridian deconstruction, Foucault's archaeology, etc. And just one third point, and then I'll shut up. And I know we need another, maybe we can work on something in the future, but Lefebvre wrote a book called The Structuralist Ideology, Ideologie Structuralism, in which he has a long, about 90-page, confrontation with Althusser.
With the structuralism,
period. And this was written in 71, and then, put out in pocketbook in 75, in which he looks at structuralism in general, and very much against structuralism, which he considers Althusser part of, as a kind of new Iliadism, in the ancient sense of a new kind of system of paradoxes philosophically. And he accuses Althusser somewhat of being a Cartesian empiricist. Yes, I have it too. Yeah, I have it out too. So we're on the same page. Yeah, there we go. We're clear with each other. So anyway, I just thought that this would be, very interesting for further, the people that are interested here and, myself. And I also want to mention too, and then I will go to Jose, who's been waiting for a question. Another thing that I thought what you brought up was very interesting and that we need to rethink is this whole notion of interpolation, this question of interpolation in ideology. And that this is something that needs to be brought back around. It's not really part of everyday, left conversation.
Yeah.
What is interpolation and its relationship to ideology? And ideology is materiality, really, in a sense, in that regard. So again, thank you so much. You don't need to respond to me, but yeah.
Okay, Jose.
Thank you, Michael, for including me. I would like to begin to asking sorry for my bad English, so I will try to be short in the question too. Andy, about the at the end of your writings, you said something about Nico Poulantzas and his tried to work together the things and the writings of Althusser and a little bit of Lefebvre, also Foucault and some influence. So if you could talk about this latest work, one of the latest work of Poulantzas, the State, Power and Socialism, and how it contributes, let's say, in some way to this discussion of humanism and anti-humanism. And thank you, Michael, for allowing me the question.
It's all good, Jose. Thank you.
Oh, great. Whoa. Shall I have a crack at it, Michael? Yeah.
Yeah. And then you go ahead.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for bringing up Sartre. It's funny that Sartre liked Henri Lefebvre more than Lefebvre liked Sartre, because he wrote a book called On Existentialism that was very critical of Henri Lefebvre, even though Sartre was talking about the question of method, as you pointed out. He talks about I think it was the regressive analytical style of Henri Lefebvre, that one should think about how we do research, and that should be the method that we adopt. But actually, Henri Lefebvre didn't really like Sartre that much, which is odd because he kind of liked Heidegger, but he didn't like Sartre, and he didn't like Husserl. He had some issues with Merleau-Ponty. He just didn't like. His argument with existentialism was, the critical dialectical method. He thought was Sartre knew nothing about Marx, essentially. And Althusser pretty much said the same thing. He didn't like it at all in terms of what he was doing with Marx. I think critical dialectical reason is amazing, but who am I to say that? But it was clear then that there were some battles that were in motion, and the wounds were open, and the factionalization of the camps that Sartre was, to me was always the epitome of the public intellectual. What he was doing just always seemed to be amazing, and I don't know whether some of them might be jealous. It's possible Henri Lefebvre could be jealous. I've read his book on existentialism, critiquing Sartre, and I just can't see necessarily. Okay, the language isn't Marxist. The fused group and some of the serial, the people. I can't remember the exact language now. It's been so long since I've looked at it. And the practical inert. Why you wouldn't call it sort of fixed capital or sort of dead labor, or it's but when you read Nausea, there's no reason why that wouldn't fit in with when you think of touching doorknobs, that how do human beings relate to inanimate objects, in a labor process? How do we relate when we're walking around a building and seeing a skyscraper up there? It must be a little bit of the feeling of nausea because there seems to be a disconnect. And you know, when Henri Lefebvre uses Heidegger in his urban writings, and he talks about what is his words? He doesn't say. He says there's a difference between habitat and a Hegelian notion of it's not habitus, the Bourdieu concept, but it's another way in which it's much more about being and metaphysical than just living space. So everyday life is a
substitution of place for
yes, exactly. And he's drawing on a lot of Heidegger's work on questions of humanism and yes, on place and what place is in a phenomenological sense. So it's peculiar why he doesn't like Sartre, and I just think I think it's the kind of Marxist. He doesn't like some of the reinterpretation of Marx, because it is a kind of reinterpretation of Marx. And Althusser was damning. I've never read the script. I've never seen any kind of transcript of the lecture, but
I don't think it exists.
I don't think it exists, but apparently
Reggie Debray.
Yeah, he's mentioned it, and Balibar's mentioned it, haven't they? And they've said that, you know, it was Sartre was just kind of destroyed by Althusser's brilliance. So I don't know, but you have to know who your friends are again. And I think, you know, Sartre, you know, how can one ditch, you know, how can one ditch it? It's just absurd, isn't it? So, and, you know, you just have to work with it. And both books, you know, both volumes of, as well as being in nothingness, they're just incredible. You know, the vignette with the waiter is extraordinary, isn't it? In being in nothingness, you know, what's a way to do it?
Of bad faith, and
of bad faith, exactly.
About the French Communist Party.
Absolutely.
Hands,
yeah,
right?
No, it's brilliant stuff. It's brilliant stuff. Moving on to Jose and Palantes. This thing about Palantes was really interesting, because it was Balibar who told me that it was Palantes' idea that part of the Union of the Left, they should get the Marxists together to meet. And apparently a couple of meetings took place in Henri Lefebvre's apartment, which is right next to the Beaubourg Centre, right next to Pompidou. And they had various theoreticians there who were talking about not only just a union of the left, but a union of the Marxist intellectual left. And is there a way in which we can bury the old axes of war? I think, what is it? Enterrer le vieil hache de guerre. We can stop, you know, that those axes that we're using to hit each other on the head, sometimes quite literally. Can we, you know, just put them down and just come together and have a talk about this? But they did fail. I think one of the reasons they failed, of course, is in 1979, Nikos Palantes committed suicide. He was very similar disposition psychologically to Althusser, I think. Had quite a periodic moments and periods of real depression. And his book, State Power and Socialism, and some of the stuff on political classes in the state, Henri Lefebvre cites one of the projects that Lefebvre was doing in the 1970s. He wrote 4 volumes on the state de l'État. Incredible piece of work that he was writing later on in his life, you know, and he just ripped them off during the course of the 70s. Some were looking at what Mao said about the state and what theories of the capitalist theories of the state, and then he went on the contradictions of the state, and then he brought them up to date and looking at state in the modern age. And he uses a lot of Palantes in that, which is interesting, because this was the time when Palantes was moving into his Euro-communism phase and the democratic road to socialism, which he talks about a lot in State Power and Socialism, as I remember. And Henri Lefebvre cites that favorably in his book. But it is curious why he would also embrace Althusser, who really didn't he hated it, in short. He hated Eurocommunism because it was seen as being, it was giving up on the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is something that he thought when the French Communist Party gave up on the dictatorship in 1978, it was a grave technical mistake, strategic mistake. And so he didn't, even though the Palances was a student of Althusser and they were very close, and I think Althusser saw Palances only days before he committed suicide in 1979, is that he was still an advocate of, he was advocating Eurocommunism at that time, which Althusser thought was really problematic. And actually he points the finger at Gramsci. Gramsci is the culprit according to Althusser. Althusser is one of the few Marxists I've come across who kind of really is critical about Gramsci. There's not many of them around. Gramsci is often seen as the, you know, the cult hero of, you know, for Marxist left. Althusser didn't like some of Gramsci's work, his philosophy of practice, his historicity, his idea of Eurocommunism. He wrote a book called Kafir, what should be done. Later on in his life, and he's very critical of Gramsci, and this was just republished in English because it was a posthumous book. So he didn't like Palances where he was going with Eurocommunism. But that debate about the democratic road to socialism is one that one needs to talk about again. And I think there was some magnificent stuff in Palances' writings that I know a lot around the state, the capitalist state, and what the state is, and where the state could be, you know, was the condensation of class relations, and it was always something that was possible to enter and to usurp and to somehow reappropriate. Whether those circumstances are still prevalent is a big question.
Thank you very much, Andy. I think we should stop. It's almost half an hour past our time. Now, everyone wants you to come back for French philosophy, but I would love your next visit to be on Finnegan's Wake, to tell you the truth.
Oh, okay. That'd be great too. That'll be great.
Yeah.
That'll be.
And here comes everybody. We had a lot of people today.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Michael. Thank you for inviting me, and the questions and the disruption. You know, kind of fuck the disruption. You know, it's you know, it is what it is.
And what a great group of people who fought back against it.
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody, and you know, I hope we can meet again, as it were. We can have, you know, it's actually curious that, you know, we probably never would ever get together in the one space anyway. So this has brought us together for une rencontre, you know. And so it's thank you for being attentive and the questions. And Michael, thank you for inviting me. It's always a great pleasure.
I excuse my distractiveness today. I just had to deal with some things. But Andy, I would encourage people, if you haven't read Marx, Dead and Alive, Andy's book from last year, to go to MR and get it, or we will have it available on the MEP site again later in the week. Andy, thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
I put our upcoming events in the chat because when you have someone from an organization giving a litany, using a good word from Catholic youth, of upcoming events, no one listens anyway, but I did put them in the chat. There's a lot coming up, and thank you for everyone who came today. And these are all questions that we need to work on together. And Andy, I appreciate your making such a good presentation with all that static in between. Thank you again. And the recording should be ready in about 3 or 4 days.
Thank you very much, everybody. Have a nice day. Have a nice afternoon. Have a nice evening.